Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. Thank you for joining us. My name is Todd Rogers. I'm a professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. I'm the faculty director of the Behavioral Insights Group. Who you just heard is Maya Nixick. She is the program director of the Behavioral Insights Group. We are grateful to have you here and very excited to share the work of Max Bazerman and Mike Luca in their newest book, The Power of Experiments. The structure of what we're going what's going to happen is I'm going to ask Max and Mike to answer a couple of questions. We'll have a bit of conversation, and then I will ask questions that are sent to me and us through the Q&A function in Zoom. I am looking at it right now. People have already sent me Q&As. So towards the end of this hour, we will start answering those. I will very briefly introduce Max and Mike, and then we'll get started. So Max is a professor at the Harvard Business School in the Negotiations, Organizations, and Markets Group. He is the founding faculty director of the Behavioral Insights Group with Iris Bonet, which I took over from them a couple of years ago. The entire Behavioral Insights Group at Harvard exists because of the blood, sweat, and tears that Max and Iris put into it. So thank you for starting this, Max. It's a great service to the school and the broader community. Mike Luca is also, he is an associate professor at the Harvard Business School. He is also in the Negotiations, Organizations, and Markets Group. And the two of them teach a class in the spring on behavioral economics and experiments, which we will talk about at the end of this hour. And they are going to talk now about their new book, The Power of Experiments. Mike and Max, would you guys open up by just telling us about yourselves, please?
Sure. So I'm an economist at Harvard Business School. And before we get started, I just wanted to thank everybody for tuning in. We're super excited about the content in this book, super excited to be talking about experiments more broadly, and grateful for BIG for hosting us to chat about this, and to Todd for taking the time to talk. My interest in this book really has been like years in the making. So I get to talk about myself and my own interests, but I think perhaps more interesting is the way that we got it started thinking about this book. Probably about 6 years ago, Max and I had taught a class that was joint between the business school and the policy school. And the class was called Behavioral Insights, and it was an immersive course in which we worked on projects with students to use behavioral insights to help shape policy and improve decision-making. And through the process, it was pretty clear that experiments were a big part of that. And for me, part of what was exciting is thinking about the transition of experiments from more of an academic tool, which I think it still is in an important way, but to also being a managerial tool. And the part that we are interested in is, what are the insights that you would want managers and policymakers to be thinking about if they're thinking about using experiments to help make decisions?
Hi, I'm Max, and I've been an experimentalist kind of all of my life, certainly all of my professional life. I got my doctorate in 1979, and the core methodology I've used throughout my career is a laboratory experiment. And one of the amazing things that's happened in the last 10 to 15 years is that experiments have moved out of the lab and into the field. So while at my core, I'm still kind of a laboratory guy, I've been stunned by seeing the most exciting developments around me by the next generation of scholars, which includes Mike Luca and Todd Rogers, but also people like John Bashirs and Katie Milkman, who have really moved out of the lab into the field. And in the process, this has created truly a new way of thinking about the notion of experiments. And Mike really came to me with the idea of we should put together this book to organize what we know and help steer people in the right direction as they enter this field and need to understand a variety of key elements about the power of experiments.
Got it. Great. So why did you decide to write this book, and who's the audience? So who do you imagine when you're writing it is going to read it and how they're going to benefit from it?
So we decided to write it, I think, basically after this conversation we had in Max's office several years ago when we were talking in part about class, but in part about, I had asked Max how many experiments he thought that he'd been in over the course of the past year. And I don't recall your exact initial answer, but like it quickly dawned on us that we've all been subjects in lots of experiments, and it's something worth thinking about, the role that we all play in this and how you can ensure that experiments are going to be useful for companies and useful for policymakers and also good for customers at the other end. So the motivation for the book was thinking about what the landscape of what we know on experiments has been. And when we looked around, we saw lots of material on how to do blocking, how to do clustering, how to do compute standard errors on experiments. We saw things on power calculations. We saw kind of this technical material. We also saw some material kind of motivating why people should run experiments, but we wanted to kind of dive a little bit more into a couple of key elements. Like one is some of the managerial decisions for people who run experiments, because we see lots of decisions happening there. And when we looked around the business school curriculum and looked around the way that organizations were thinking about this, we saw some room to help shape understanding of how to best leverage experiments in an organization. The second motivation for this, and this really has two parts, is we've been involved in two different parts of the world, some overlapping, some separately, where we've seen experiments really take off and just have been fascinating, and we think have led to some impressive gains. And those two parts have been using behavioral interventions to help improve decision making. And Todd, obviously your work has been a large part of this. The behavioral insights team in the UK has been a part of this. Ideas 42, and probably people on this call have also been part of this. So this is something that we thought was fascinating and wanted to start to get a sense of how we got there, what that landscape looks like, and how we could continue moving in that direction. And the parallel branch, which we thought was an interesting contrast, but with a surprising overlap, has been the tech sector, where you've seen experiments proliferate. So if you think about the Googles, Amazons, Airbnbs of the world, you see that they're all running thousands of experiments per year. At the same time, while we think experiments have been super valuable in both of these contexts, we see that there were some lessons that you could learn by looking back at the experiments people have run, drawing on the academic research on kind of how to best design and interpret experiments, and sort of help to lay out a path forward around experimentation.
So I would add to that by noting that the different kinds of professionals who are in this space has increased in diversity of knowledge dramatically as this field has evolved. There are people who came out of the laboratory often on the psychology side. There are economists who didn't do experiments but moved into the experimental realm. There are professional school students who are now learning this as a basic topic of how to improve public policy decision-making. There's the tech sector that Mike noted. There's the organizations that are focused on this world, including the Behavioral Insights Group and Ideas 42, the World Bank and others. And I guess one of the observations that I would make, and I don't say this critically, just descriptively, because people come from different places, they end up knowing parts of what they need to know to be a great field experimentalist, and they often don't know other pieces. So there are people who have tremendous technical skills, but haven't really mastered the behavioral science literature. There are other people who came out of a laboratory tradition who don't really know the details of the new issues that arise when you go into the field. So our book is really meant to be a sort of a great starting point for lots of different people who know part of the story and maybe missing other parts of the story, and to present all these different pieces in ways that will come to life and help unify the field as we move forward in this new world.
Got it. That's so it is not a handbook for running field experiments. It's for managers who are.
I think that that's right. So if you don't know anything about statistics, and you read our book, you're not going to be ready to run an experiment when you're done or to analyze the data. But I think that if you are a professional who ends up with the task of managing people who are running experiments within your organization, I think that you'll learn a whole lot about the right questions to ask, the right ways to think through what different design options would look like. When someone proposes one experimental design to you to solve a problem, I think you'll be well equipped to think about alternative designs that might be more effective. When someone's designing an experiment and they're thinking about a very short-term dependent variable without thinking about the unintended consequences, you're more likely to note those. So it will give you the broad tools that you need to think about the broad function of field experimentation using behavioral science.
Got it. Thank you. So it's both for those who are doing the work to get a broad picture of the origins and different perspectives on it, but also people who might be managing people doing it to get a sense of the value of it.
Yeah. So the middle of the book, where Mike Luca is he's the lead author of the book, but he's a heavy lead author of the middle chapters, which provide 6 tech experiments. Or tech organizations that run experiments. And in each of those chapters, there are a variety of things that we're impressed with, but also we're sort of surprised that people within those organizations didn't think about this world more clearly beforehand. And we would hope that those same managers, if they had read this book, which obviously didn't exist 10 years ago, when they implemented a lot of the ideas, they would have been able to do so with a more informed perspective.
Got it. Okay, so Mike, tell us about one of the tech experiments, the chapters on tech, maybe the Airbnb chapter.
That's a good one for Mike.
Great. Yeah, so as Max said, we have several tech experiment chapters. I'll get into the Airbnb chapter, but I will sort of give one other point beforehand, which I think is part of the goal of the book, which is just kind of motivating the value of experimentation. So to build on what Max was saying, I think that now, we all sort of know that experimentation is starting to happen, at least in some parts of the economy, in tech and in policy. And one of the striking things that we noticed while writing the book is just the fact that some of the experimentalists that were going into organizations, so these were largely, initially at least, social scientists that were coming from academia or came out of grad school and then went to run experiments, and now is increasingly the organizations themselves, but found a number of examples where there were large gains to get from even very simple experiments. And this, I think, is something we saw both in the behavioral insights world and in the tech world. So in the behavioral insights world, we could think about something like tweaking the letters that are going out to delinquent taxpayers, which was the behavioral insights team's first major experiment. And when you think about that, it's an organization that have been sending out letters for ages. And it's not that the social psychology or behavioral insights that they were using were necessarily new. They took social norms, put this into a letter, added it as a sentence, and experimentally tested it. But what was new is that step of experimentally testing the letters to say, we all have intuition about what might work. And what this does is just helps us to know where we're going to get the most out of a letter or a change or a tweak that a policymaker or manager is making. So that was one example. Another example that struck me as we reflected on it from the experiments we were looking at, and this is one from the tech sector, is an experiment that Steve Tudelis, Thomas Blake, and Chris Nosko had run with eBay. And they at the time were part of a research team that eBay had. And they wanted to see, is advertising effective? Which seems like it should be in the wheelhouse of what experiments people would have been running already. But what they found is that there hadn't been much experimentation at eBay about testing the impact of the ads they ran on Google and other platforms. So they ran what in some ways was a straightforward experiment that's uncontroversial. They tested different keywords that they were buying to see the returns to ads on the platform. And what they found is that out of the $50 million a year, roughly, that eBay had been spending on ads, a large part of it ended up to not yield positive returns. It ended up being essentially kind of a waste of money because they were advertising on words like eBay and then things that were associated with eBay. And the main insight there was that people would have gotten to those pages even in the absence of eBay advertising on them. So due to the targeted nature of the ads, it turned out that they were kind of they were targeting the people that would have been there even in the absence of the advertising. And eBay and others have started to use that insight to then think about how they should change their advertising campaign. So I think for lots of companies, both in tech savvy areas and in less tech savvy areas, that there's a lot of gains that people are having. So I'd say kind of the opening part of the book is sort of motivating all of this. And then the transition is to some of the nuance that comes in experimentation. So the Airbnb experiment is one that I had been involved in with our former colleague, Ben Edelman, and former doctoral student, Dan Spursky, who actually now works at Uber. And the motivation for this experiment had been a pretty simple observation, which is that over the past 20 years or so, we've increasingly seen products and transactions and services moving online. So instead of going into store to buy something, you might go into Amazon. Instead of booking a hotel by calling Marriott or looking for a landlord, you might go onto Airbnb to find a small place that you would stay at. And when thinking about this, we were thinking about what the implications of online transactions were for society. And there are a number of predictions people have made over time. So one set of predictions has been that the world would get better in efficiency terms. So if you think about introducing an online platform, this reduces search costs, could increase your product variety, could lower prices, and could make it easier for you to find a good match for you. So people have documented that there's more books available as a result of digitization and online platforms. Prices of life insurance have come down. And actually, if you think about Airbnb, like the presence of Airbnb is sort of facilitated by online platforms. But there's a second subtler implication that people had posited early on in the internet age, which is that they thought that by having more arm's length transactions, that you might not just see more efficiency, but you might see more equity and less discrimination in online markets. And the hypothesis was essentially as follows. You're having transactions that are arm's length. So by reducing the information that people have that they could use to discriminate against others, that you could essentially reduce the extent of discrimination in a market. And some of the early research that came out of it was consistent with this hypothesis. So there's a great paper by Florian Zettelmeyer, Fiona Scott Morden, that looks at car markets and purchases of vehicles and shows that if you look at purchases offline or that initiate offline, that there's discrimination, and that discrimination has persisted over time on the basis of race and gender. But when the purchase is initiated online, that a lot of the discrimination that happened in the offline world has gone away. And the thing that struck us is that that paper was written, it was published in 2003, and we were thinking between 2003 and now, a lot has changed about online world. It's not just that everything is an arm's length transaction, it's actually that platforms have a lot of choice in whether or not to make something an arm's length transaction, how anonymous to allow someone to be on the internet. And I'll just sort of like flash two cartoons that we refer to in the book, and that I think helps to capture some of the things that are going on. Probably a lot of people on this call are familiar with a famous New Yorker cartoon in which there are two dogs that are looking at the screen, and they say, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. So that was I think 1993 cartoon. I may be getting the year wrong. But that was an older New Yorker cartoon where they were trying to say the anonymous that the internet is allowing for anonymity. But what most people who are familiar with that cartoon don't know is that in 2015, the New Yorker solicited a second cartoon that had the same two dogs going on and said, hey, remember when nobody knew who we were? And the basic idea was that the anonymity that characterized the early internet was slowly creeping away as platforms were starting to learn more about people and help to reduce the social distance between people buying and selling a product. So we set out to understand what the implications of this were by looking at Airbnb, who is one of the leaders in helping to reduce some of the anonymity of online transactions. So on Airbnb, they had kind of had these robust personal profiles where you would have your picture and your name, and then you could decide after seeing someone's picture and name whether or not you would want them to stay with you, which is quite different from what you would see on Expedia or hotels.com or Booking, and wanted to see if this facilitated discrimination at a level that you wouldn't be able to see on a Bookings of the world. So we ran an experiment in which we varied the profiles and sent out requests to stay with more than 6,000 people on Airbnb. And what we found is that guests with African American sounding names. So this was following a method that's used in audit studies and sociology, psychology, and economics. But what we did is kind of vary the name of the person that would be staying with a host, and found that if you have a name that is statistically likely to be African American, you're about 16% less likely to be accepted on Airbnb relative to a guest with a white sounding name.
Thanks, Mike. Got it. So how did Airbnb react when you discovered that, when you published that paper?
Yeah. So it's interesting. So we had actually had an earlier paper using non-experimental data before that. Airbnb had been aware of it, and initially they hadn't really made any changes. And then after we wrote this paper, we got, so Ben and I had gotten an email from another former colleague of ours who then had become an economist at Airbnb, who said, let me come to Boston and we could chat about this and figure out, are there design changes that Airbnb might make to reduce discrimination? So we had ordered from T. Anthony's Pizza, like the one on Com Ave. So we ordered T. Anthony's Pizza, and we decided that we should try to think about what are changes that Airbnb could make that might reduce discrimination and might but might also kind of allow for a viable platform like Airbnb to continue operating. And I can't talk about like the nature of the discussion beyond saying that was like the broad topic. But what I can talk about is some proposals we made, and also some changes that Airbnb had made at the end. So in the wake of it, we started reflecting a lot. So this is with my initial set of collaborators and also with Ray Fissman. And we were thinking, like, if you're sitting at Airbnb, what should you do to reduce discrimination? And we had a few buckets of things that Airbnb might think about. One is you could make the big change and just get rid of all the pictures and names and make it look a lot more like Booking. And my sense from interactions with Airbnb is that was basically off the table as a change from their perspective. They thought that was a bridge too far, at least in the early days. Then we said the second option is to start thinking about tweaks at the margin that they could make to reduce the amount of discrimination. So to give a sense of the types of things, Airbnb already had a feature called instant booking. And on instant booking, I could go to your place. If you had listed availability, I could automatically book it without you having to give me explicit approval. So this is kind of a subtle change, but if you think about the behavioral economics of what's going on, this has the potential to reduce discrimination by helping to move it to be more like a Booking or an Expedia. And one area where we thought that there could be a lot of progress is by trying to nudge more people to use instant booking as a feature. And by getting them to do that, you could get rid of discrimination and also have other positive benefits for the platform by making it more efficient at the same time, reducing search costs, making it easy for the market to clear. That's one bucket. The second bucket we talked about is just reducing the prominence of the pictures and names on the platform. So for instance, it used to be that if you go onto the search page and you search for rental property in Portland, Maine, you would see the properties, you would see the maps, you would see the prices, and all that sort of looks like what you would see if you were on Expedia. But in each tile, you would also see the pictures of the person that you'd be staying with. So we had made this suggestion and written this up in an HBR article that you could potentially reduce the amount of discrimination by just reducing the prominence of the pictures and the names, move that onto a different page, and sort of emphasize the things that we think are more relevant for a given stay. A third thing we talked about is trying to have clearer terms of service. And I think this is true of platforms in general. What are the rules around discrimination, and reminding people of them when the timing is relevant. So this was kind of like the flavor of things we were discussing. So Airbnb then in the background set up a task force, and there's a lot of public information about this task force now, but it included a bunch of faculty, but also included a bunch of civil rights activists. So Eric Holder was on the task force. So he's a former attorney general. Laura Murphy was on the task force, and they all kind of said, let's pull.
Robert Livingston from HKS was on the task force.
And basically what Airbnb thought is like, let's get together all the proposals for changes we might make and put together a proposal for how to move forward. And for them, I think kind of they were thinking, what are the factors that we should have in mind? And they were kind of thinking about things like how will the growth of the platform be affected? How will the rates of discrimination be affected? How will the public view the sufficient, like whether a change is sufficient or not? How will regulators and policymakers view the changes? So after a bunch of work that they had done in the background to think about the different things, they announced a set of changes that included a commitment to increase instant booking, commitment to have clearer terms of service, a commitment to reduce the prominence of pictures and names on the platform. They also, and I wanted to flag this since this is a discussion of experiments, is they kind of recognize that this isn't a one-time fix that they're going to make and then everything will be over. So they created a data science team that would focus on issues around discrimination and think about how things are evolving in an ongoing basis. So that's sort of kind of like the Airbnb landscape.
So I've taught Mike's Airbnb case a number of times. I consider the head of diversity and inclusion at Airbnb and the chief economist at Airbnb my friends. Watching this story evolve, I'm stunned by how much change has occurred, change that wouldn't have happened without the experiment that Mike and his colleagues ran. At the same time, I'm not fully happy with that they haven't gone even further than they have. So we can see both the importance of experiments in creating change that matters from a public policy perspective, but we can also see that how leaders within that organization could well have managed this process in a fundamentally different way if they had been on top of experiments at a much earlier stage.
Interesting. Okay, so I have one last question on the Airbnb, and then I want to get to that broader topic of whether of social welfare, of whether it's good or bad for consumers and citizens, whether these experiments are happening. How do policymakers, let's think still with Airbnb, for example, how do policymakers interact with the use of experiments and understanding discrimination and regulating Airbnb? So you touch on this in the book, and I think it's fascinating.
Yeah.
My question may be. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. After the initial experiment, we kind of regrouped and thought about who are all the stakeholders that are going on, and we identified a few. So one is Airbnb managers, and they had to kind of think about how they would weigh different factors. Two was Airbnb customers, who kind of the platform was heavily marketed as a place where you would belong anywhere. And that was sort of inconsistent with the idea of having a platform that at the same time facilitates widespread discrimination. Three, policymakers and regulators. And we started getting contacted by a set of agencies that are at varying levels, some state governments, some federal agencies. And they were interested in a few things, like kind of, is there a legal liability for Airbnb? And historically, that's been a pretty murky territory. So because of CDA 230, platforms are given a lot of freedom in like the way that they design their platforms. At the same time, there was some precedent for platforms being held liable for changes they make that facilitate discrimination. So regulators were sort of thinking about what kinds of things can they do? So one was, is there liability? At least some agencies thought that there was a case to be made, but it would be time consuming and costly for all parties involved. So would rather see Airbnb make its own changes. A second thing is we saw the state of California come to an agreement with Airbnb that had a bunch of parts. I won't summarize them all, but kind of one part that I'll highlight is that they had seen our evidence. And one thing that they struggled with is they sort of knew how to investigate offline discrimination. So this kind of is not a new issue, right? So in both short-term rentals and long-term rentals, this comes up. But they hadn't really gotten much traction in investigating online discrimination. I think it's generally true that it was tricky, partly because of terms of service and just it looks like a different process than you would do offline. So part of what they agreed to is for Airbnb to make it easier for them to run mini audits of people that are on the platform. So, and then they could kind of directly see if there seems to be discrimination. Now, when thinking kind of step back from California for a second, when thinking about the broader set of regulatory stakeholders, you want to be thinking about how transparent is Airbnb being, and you want them to be transparent both with customers, but also with regulators in ways where they could do this style of audit as well, so they can know what's going on, and then beef up enforcement. What does enforcement look like? It looks like a couple of things, right? So it looks like talking with Airbnb about their design changes and the role they're playing. It also looks like enforcement potentially against some of the larger hosts. So one nuanced detail in the United States, at least, is that different people might be subject to different discrimination policies because of exceptions of Fair Housing Act. So if you have a small place and not a lot of units, you might be treated a little differently than a large place with lots of units, but there may well be hosts on Airbnb that would be legally liable for discriminating against guests. So those are the types of things that I'm thinking about. But I think that the formal regulation is important, but I also think just the conversations and the transparency with regulators is important. Let me just generalize a little bit too, because I think there are lessons we learned about Airbnb and discrimination on online platforms, but I think through the experiment and through this process, and as we reflected on in the book, there are a couple of broader lessons that we think we could pull from that. So one being, looking at Airbnb, it's not the case that anybody in the platform set out to try to create a marketplace that would facilitate discrimination, right? So they just wanted to facilitate transactions and simply had this kind of blind spot. And actually, if you look at a quote from the CEO, Brian Chesky, he had suggested that part of what happened is they didn't have a diverse enough workforce and therefore weren't really that keyed into issues around discrimination. But when I think about that, a lesson for experimentalists is that it's very tempting to think about a very narrow set of outcomes. So in this case, growth, profitability, speed of transactions going through. But it's also important to think about what unintended consequences there might be and have a broad set of things that you're considering. So can think about all the stakeholders, all the things you want to happen, but some of the problems that could also happen, and directly be measuring and evaluating on that as things go along. In fact, one of the things that companies like Airbnb and Uber now have on their mind is, as you make changes, how does it change both the thickness of the market, the profitability of the market, but also the level of discrimination. So I think that's kind of an important lesson that we learned through the process, that I think isn't just, it's not just about Airbnb, and it's not even just about the tech sector. I think for all platforms and all experimenters, it's something to think about.
Great. Okay, thank you. So shifting gears a bit from Airbnb, another topic you touch on in the book is whether experiments are good or bad for customers. So Max, should people be happy that companies are running lots of experiments?
Yes, but they should also be cautious. So but before talking about experiments, let me talk about another sort of skill that I think is really useful. It's called arithmetic. And I think arithmetic is good, but that doesn't mean that arithmetic hasn't been used to create harm in many, many contexts. And in many ways, I think about experiments in the same way. Experiments are a terrific tool that is bound to create far more good than bad in the world. But that doesn't mean that people won't use this useful skill in ways that create harm. When I hear people bring up the topic, are experiments good? I kind of convert that to, do you want companies to try new things? Do you want them to think systematically? Would it be okay if they tried it on a small group to see if they could learn in the process before rolling it out to everybody? And all these sub-questions lead to the answer, of course we want companies to think systematically in an organized way, to try new ideas, and to do it in a way that will help them learn as much as they can about how to best improve their products from a customer's perspective. So I think experiments are undoubtedly a wonderful new sort of newly adapted idea to a broader set of field contexts. But we also want to think about where they can create harm, and we want lawyers to think about what laws are needed. We want regulators to think about when new forms of regulation are needed. We certainly are enormous fans of transparency by organizations as they run experiments. So there's a lot we can think about how we can improve the ethicality of experiments and to increase the amount of societal good that they will create. But if I have to give a yes, no, it's an enthusiastic yes, experiments are good.
Mike, do you want to add to that, or that do you agree? An enthusiastic yes with qualifier.
So the qualifier is an important one, but it's like I think that experiments have the potential to do a lot of good, and I think actually part of the hope of some of the topics we cover in the book is ways to make sure that you're running experiments that'll be good for the company, but also good for the society, good for customers, good for citizens, depending on kind of who the stakeholders are. And you know, I would just second what Max was saying about transparency. One opportunity that I think is sometimes overlooked on experiments is the fact that running experiments, it gives you better information. And the concern is that you're going to give a company better information to allow them to make decisions that extract more rent from customers, right? So that's kind of a flavor of concern you might worry about. But I would also emphasize that these are things companies already risk doing. And one benefit, and it's, I think, a side benefit of experiments, is that it allows for more explicit discussions around things. So for instance, if you see a trade-off between profit and discrimination, it's not something you would just now say, oh, maybe there is, maybe there isn't, let's not think about it. It's something that you need to sort of explicitly discuss. If you're sitting at StubHub and you run an experiment that where you shroud fees to customers, you can now see, well, some customers drop off. It may have some brand costs, but it may increase short-term profitability. And now you're allowing managers to have more open and explicit discussion about the fact that there are trade-offs and are things going wrong. So I think that rather than saying are experiments good or bad, I think that one managerial question is how can you make sure that experiments are good, and how can you make sure you're running them in a way where you feel comfortable with the map between the data you're getting and the decisions that you're making.
Great. Okay, so now I am going to ask just this, an important question that I know we've all talked about and people have been asking me in the questions is, can you expand on like the ethics of this? Is it unethical for customers to be part of experiments? What do you think something's good? Shouldn't it be automatically rolled out? In a way, we're asking for a script. What do you say to people, to managers who are like, well, if we think it's good, let's do it to everybody.
So I'm stunned by the number of times I've worked in real organizations, and a client wants my opinion about the best way to do things. And I've had a lot of experience, and I'm a professor at the Harvard Business School, et cetera. And when I develop an opinion, they then want to believe it's 100% true. But there's no reason to believe it's 100% true.
Max, you have a high hit rate though, Max.
I hope I have a very high hit rate, but if I have a very high hit rate, it's still not going to be close to 100%. And the notion that you would want to roll out a new idea across 150 countries on 100 million customers, when you could easily try it on 10,000 very quickly, I think is just a kind of a bizarre notion. So I think that the weird aspect of the question is that we've gotten it wrong for so long, that we just rolled out new ideas without experimenting. When I think that it should become the norm that new ideas are tested in the clearest, most transparent way possible. And experiments are a terrific tool, again, for thinking clearly, for developing new ideas and then finding out whether they're right or wrong. Any experimentalist can tell you about the ideas that they've had that they were enthusiastic about that just didn't happen to be right. And my reaction is, why not find out rather than roll out on a massive basis?
Great. Okay, I've a question from the audience. This one is about, I think it's complicated. I'm going to read it verbatim. It's from John Van Santen. Do you address the necessity of good statistical practices, especially when there's a pressing urgency? For example, I just read Columbia professor Andrew Gelman's blog on the Stanford study of coronavirus prevalence. And for background, there was an estimate of its prevalence that is consequential if we think it's true, and is now hotly contested. And Gelman concludes, the authors of the paper owe us all an apology. We wasted time and effort, and policymakers especially, discussing this paper whose main selling point was that some numbers are essentially the product of statistical error. So how do we think about these trade-offs? There's a lot of trade-offs in there.
So there's an enormous discussion in the social science about the replicability issue and whether or not we can trust results that are out there. And obviously, I don't even know the experiment that our colleague who just asked that question is asking. But when I see the critiques of Gelman and a handful of other very visible critics, overall, I think that the fact that we're raising our standards on replicability and care and precision of experimentation is a good thing. But I also think that sometimes the desire to criticize goes too far, and that there's an awful lot of things that we've learned with pretty good statistical techniques that could have been more precise with even better statistical techniques. And I don't want to sort of destroy the development of good knowledge because it doesn't pass some kind of methods police to policemen who haven't even been appointed to the task. And so when I think about the wide variety of developments that have to occur quickly in the COVID era, I think that there's bound to be trade-offs between implementation and how confident we are with the knowledge. So I'll make up something. Imagine that we had a new medicine that we were 98% confident would immunize us against COVID. Would we want to consider using it? I think we certainly would want to consider it. What happens if we don't have enough experimental evidence in yet? What do we do in that case? I think that these are very hard questions, and I certainly don't want to be at either end. It's great that we test medicines in a very systematic and clear way. On the other hand, if we had to be 100% sure before we used any medicine, too many people could die in the process. So that makes it a very, very hard question, and certainly not one where I'm willing to endorse one answer or the other without knowing lots of the details of the specific experiment.
So I won't say anything about that specific experiment, but I will say that it's like companies should be thinking about having infrastructure built up, right? It's something we talk about a little bit in the book. So for instance, I would point to an Uber series of Uber experiments that we discussed around the rollout of a new product. Now, Uber is an interesting case, and Amazon is also an interesting case because they both built up teams around how do you design and implement an experiment. And I think lots of companies are sort of thinking about how do you get the infrastructure right so then when you test something, you can have more confidence in the results that are coming out of it. At Amazon, for instance, they have, I think they're up to almost 200 PhD economists that are working throughout the company on various issues, some of them around experiments. At Uber, they have teams of people that are working on the design and implementation of experiments. And I think something that Uber takes seriously is how do you make sure that you're getting the most out of experiments? And actually, they don't just run quick A/B tests on everything that they want to do, they have a process, and the process is kind of thinking about how do we innovate our product and carefully use a variety of types of data, and ranging from discussions with employees, discussions with managers, discussions with users, to observational data from historical stuff, to A/B tests that are maybe at the driver level but still have some problems, to big city level rollouts of things. So I would sort of point to this Uber experiment as an example where I thought they did a lot of careful work. So they started by running simulations. I'll say what the question was. The question they were looking at is they were thinking about whether to roll out this product that many people on this call may have used now, which is Uber Express Pool. So basically there's Uber Express where you so there's Uber Express where you kind of walk to a destination rather than having them come to your house and they pick you up there, and that allows you to get more quickly from A to B. There's Uber Pool where they pick me up, then pick Max up, then pick Todd up, and we all kind of carpool to where we're going. And they said, should we have Uber Express Pool where we sort of combine some of these features? And what was on their mind is they could just look at who uses it if they roll it out. And the concern there would be maybe people are using it, but maybe they don't like it, and maybe it's crowding out all the other products that they have and not really improving the market overall. So they started off by having a variety of discussions about whether this might make sense as a product. Then they built on that by doing simulations on historical data to see how sensitive are people to wait time, how sensitive are people to having someone in the car with them. Then they started building up to run new experiments, and they built up to these market level experiments where they rolled it out in a couple of cities just to make sure the thing works, right? So one advantage of experimenting is it's hard to build products, and then this is sort of proof of concept. Then they did the 6-city rollout where they used synthetic controls to sort of try to understand how business is changing both for Express Pool and for their other products. Then once they had those results, they went back to A/B testing to sort of fine tune some of the parameters and redesign pieces of the product. And I don't think that they think their process is perfect, but I think that that they take seriously how to design a process that would allow them to learn from all the types of data they have, and experiments are one piece of that. And to me, like the idea of just saying, oh, there's challenges in that, so just throw that out altogether, it doesn't seem like a sound strategy. So I would just say it's more a question of investing to make sure you're getting things right rather than just throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Got it. Thank you. For people in the audience who are interested in this topic of effectively managerial judgment on top of in weighing different kinds of evidence, whether it's the Uber decision to roll out Uber Express Pool or Max's hypothetical, which I hope we face sooner than it seems we will, which is a 98% likelihood that something that without enough for Corona, but not enough experimental evidence where managers have to make judgment. They have a great discussion of this with regards to the behavioral insights team, but also with regards to StubHub in weighing managerial judgment in the book. I'm going to shift gears one last time. We've talked about a lot of private sector applications of behavioral insights and experiments on this talk. In your book, you discuss public sector, private sector, and also social good. What's an area or a program of research that you're particularly excited you think can yield positive social welfare in the coming years using experiments in ways that they haven't been used before?
So before I answer that, because I'm about to plug a different university, I would say the number of different activities going on around Harvard University is simply outstanding. And I'm delighted with so many different things that my colleagues are doing. But your question leads me to think of the Behavioral Change for Good project at the University of Pennsylvania, led by Katie Milkman and Angela Duckworth, two true superstars in our field, where they basically identify a variety of problems in health, education, and finance, where they are able to identify a client trying to solve a problem, whether it's to show up at their gym, or whether it's to take some kind of medication. And they identify quote unquote clients, where they're not consulting, they're conducting research, where they identify clients that have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of potential people who could be involved in a study with transparency. And then they specify the problem and they turn the problem loose on a panel of many dozens of researchers from across the country and the world, where they develop not one or two or three ideas about how to best solve that problem, but dozens of ideas. And then they're running these kind of mega multi-dimensional experiments with potentially 40, 50, 60 different conditions, so that they can sort of harness the wisdom of lots of different people and find out what ideas best solve the problem of their client. And what I find fascinating is they're doing something that I just couldn't even imagine in the experimental world 15 years ago. And like many other innovations, I'm stunned with the potential of this sort of new approach to collecting data and collaborating across both real-world clients and academia in a very, very novel way. I'll also say that Mike and I wrote a case on the Behavioral Change for Good project, and that will be represented in our curriculum, and I assume in lots of other universities as well. And we wrote about it in the book.
Right. For those interested, the last third of the book is examples like BCFG and a chapter Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise of other research programs of using experiments in new ways to solve important social problems.
And we mentioned you once or twice as well, Todd.
That's right. Yeah, I did saw that. But
Todd's a big part of Wise.
But the chapter on BCFG is exciting and interesting because the direction of making the infrastructure available for lots of scholars to generate novel hypotheses and test them. We have just a few minutes left and lots of questions. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to let you, Max, and Mike make final remarks. Anything that you think the audience should know, and in the last minute, I will pitch the book in the classes, so that for people interested in how they can learn more. Mike, do you want to start, and then Max?
So I don't know, I think we covered a lot of ground here. So I just wanted to thank you again for taking the time to chat with us. In terms of the use of experiments, I guess the thing that I would say is some of the things that we learned, like in the process of writing the book. I think we both went in cautiously optimistic about experimentation. And I speak for myself, and Max could say if he agrees with this, that we sort of left with the same sort of both caution and optimism about the use of experiments. And the caution was both around making sure we're using them appropriately, and appropriately, I think, talks about some of the things that we've covered in this discussion, which is to be careful about the implementation details, to make sure you understand what the value of the experiment is, what the goal is, whether you're getting there. I think appropriately means helping to avoid unintended consequences and the type of myopia that could sometimes happen with experiments. And the optimism part is that we've seen a lot of organizations take these concerns seriously and start to move forward in a way that I think leads to better experimentation and to better learning. And I think BCFG is a great ending point for that, in the sense that they took a challenge that I think isn't unique to their academic interests, but I think many organizations struggle with, which is that you observe short-term outcomes on a lot of things. And they asked, well, it's actually kind of a simple but central question, which is, how do you start to think about long-term outcomes? Like, how do you get behavior change to last not just for the coming week, but for the coming months, the coming years? And I think one thing that I found exciting when looking at your work, Angela's work, Katie's work, a lot of the companies that were experimenting there, is this transition that's happening right now, where organizations are starting to think not just about should we be using experiments, but how should we be using experiments? How could we do so that's both increasing efficiency, but is also ethical and taking the concerns about experimentation seriously?
That was terrific, Mike. I would simply add that this is a young field. We look dramatically different than we did 10 years ago. And I think 10 years from now, the field's going to look dramatically different than it does now. And would be delighted to be in dialogue with many of you. And we have both courses and research programs that we hope that you can tie into, and we look forward to seeing the field develop together.
That's a great ending. Thank you, Max and Mike. So for the audience members, there are Max and Mike and Mario Small and others have developed a behavioral economics and experiments course taught at the business school in the spring.
Right.
Be offered next spring. I teach a class called The Science of Behavior Change, offered at the Kennedy School in the fall, which I think is if you were to take the sequence, they would be complementary. And this was a production of the Behavioral Insights Group, which is a Harvard University-wide network of faculty and students interested in using field experiments, behavioral insights to combine to create public value. It's housed at the Kennedy School. Maya is the program director. I'm the faculty chair. Thank you guys for joining. Max and Mike were talking about a book that just came out that they wrote called The Power of Experiments. Maya and I will send a follow-up after this to everyone who logged in with a link to the book, which I recommend, and information about the two classes. Mike and Max, did I miss anything, or are we good?
Great talking with you.
Great, this was fun. Thank you guys. Thanks, Mike, Max, and thank you
Thanks,
all the members for sharing the afternoon with us. Mike, sorry.
Thanks everyone out there.
Thank you.
Bye. Be safe, folks.